Hello and welcome. Thank you so much, Natalie, for organizing this. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with all of you today. My name is Cathleen McCaffery. Natalie and I were at Marlborough together. I graduated in '09 and I went to USC for college and I did graduate training in college counseling at UCLA. And I will be starting graduate school at Harvard starting this summer. And today, we're going to be talking about how to set your children up for success in the college admissions process, starting at a young age. This is somewhat of an interactive presentation, so we can just use the Q&A if you want to put your thoughts and responses in the Q&A, and then I can see that and respond to them live. So I'd love to just start out before I tell you too much about myself or really get into the meat of the presentation with what you believe about college and the college admissions process. And if you can just put your thoughts in the Q&A, a lot has changed since you applied, since I applied, and even more so during the pandemic. The pandemic significantly impacted college admissions. You may or may not be familiar with those changes, but we're going to get into all of them today. The process is broken. It's really hard. Like my spelling. Yeah, we don't really need spelling anymore. We all have Grammarly. Yeah, I'd love to know more of what you mean by that. College is an amazing opportunity to learn and grow, but too much hysteria around getting into the best school. Definitely, Kirsten, agree. I'll give everyone, let's see how many we have here. Okay. A few more minutes to add, and then we'll dive in. And I'm going to really be dispelling a lot of the most common myths today and giving you some really tangible, actionable tips and advice that you can use with your children, especially if you have kids who are 12 to 15 in middle school and early on in high school, as the formal college admissions process doesn't really start until 11th grade, but there are some important things that you want to keep in mind starting younger. Let's see. Okay. I have a daughter in 11th grade. Oh, and a nephew who is a freshman in college, and I'm flabbergasted, great word, at how hard colleges have gotten to get into, even safety school when I graduated from Marlborough 30 years ago. Yes, Lee, definitely. So the safety schools for you, even like for Natalie and I, are no longer safety schools. Colleges like Northeastern, for example, Boston University, that maybe were a safety school, now are highly selective and have acceptance rates, under 10% or between 10 and 20%. Yeah, definitely. And it's really because the volume of students applying to college has grown significantly, which is a good thing. We have a more educated society, but also with the rise of international students applying to the US, everyone is really focused on top 50, top 30 universities in certain cities. So those schools have just become much more competitive. And we're going to get into some strategies of how you can help your children stand out at a younger age without getting burnt out and being overwhelmed. Candidly, they ask very introspective questions from teens who BS their way through it. Yeah, well, you don't have to BS your way through it. We'll get into that today. So a little more about me. I went to Marlborough, like I said, and I own a college admissions consulting company. We call ourselves a college admissions and life path consulting. Really, the intention is to help young adults and teens figure out what they want to do with their life, what paths are open to them, what are their natural gifts, skills, and talents, and how can they use those through intentional education to create a life of success and happiness and fulfillment. So my team and I are global. There's another Marlborough alum, Sarah Parks, who works for me. She's based in Hong Kong as well. And we work with students throughout the United States and all over the world. And we have a pretty non-traditional approach to this process. I had a non-traditional path myself. I went to NYU out of Marlborough and it wasn't really the right fit. And I transferred to USC where I graduated from. And really thought I wanted to be a writer, which in some ways I still am, but have really pivoted into education and working with teenagers in a way that I didn't even really understand was possible as a career path when I was younger. So a lot of our students we found, have this very narrow-minded sense of like what's possible for them and what careers are available. And I don't know if you have all been following the news with AI and ChatGPT and all of the tech layoffs, like the world is changing at a very rapid pace right now, and that can be scary for a lot of kids, but there are also a lot of opportunities and new and exciting career paths that are emerging that, weren't even an option when I graduated, when you graduated. The jobs that your children are going to be doing may not even exist now, which can be scary, but it's also a really exciting opportunity. So our students have been accepted to pretty much every college, all the Ivies, Yale, Harvard, NYU, U Chicago, Rice, the UCs, UCLA. We also help students apply to colleges outside the US, for which the admissions process is quite different. We won't really be focusing on that today, but if you have any questions, I will share my email. You can feel free to email me and ask about that as well. So the current state of college admissions, like many of you have shared in the Q&A, is incredibly competitive. What happened during the pandemic is that almost all colleges went test optional because it wasn't possible for students to take the SAT or ACT. And what that led to was just a surge in applicants. It can be a little bit misleading because a lot of students who are applying to selective colleges may not actually have a chance to get in, right? So while acceptance rates have decreased, that's definitely something to be mindful of. A lot of students apply just to see what happens when they aren't really prepared or aren't a competitive applicant. However, regardless, test optional has really made things significantly more competitive. Harvard, for example, this year has offered admission to about 1,900 students out of 61,000 applicants. Every year, we're seeing more and more students apply to these schools. Last year, NYU had 100,000 applicants for the first time. This year, 105,000, right? So the acceptance rates are decreasing just because more and more students are applying. We're seeing this across all of the highly selective colleges, which just means colleges with acceptance rates under 25%. Especially those in urban areas like Silicon Valley, Northern California, Boston, New York. These are sort of the areas where everyone wants to be. However, most parents think, you may or may not think this, that the strategies that worked for you are what your children need to do. However, things have really changed. So even 10, 20 years ago, being a well-rounded student with a high GPA, a packed resume, great test scores was really all you needed to do in order to get into these colleges. Now things have changed just because of the volume of applicants and the fact that we have students applying from all over the world. It's really less about being well-rounded and more about being uniquely impressive and standing out in something that's very niche. Now, some people view this as a challenge. Personally, I think it's an opportunity for students to start cultivating their natural gifts, skills, and talents and channeling those into specific interests at an early age, which is going to benefit them when they are applying to jobs or starting their own businesses, et cetera. A lot of our students start businesses throughout high school or are doing really interesting and innovative work that they're genuinely interested in. So that's something to keep in mind, like following your child's genuine interest and cultivating that versus, channeling them towards a specific path that may not really be in alignment for them is important. And I think where a lot of the news and hysteria around college admissions, goes awry. And feel free, if you have questions, to just put them in the Q&A box. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but I'm happy to answer questions as they arise. So, this myth that colleges are looking for well-rounded students, you might have seen some of these articles. This one from the New York Times went around a couple of years ago that, all the colleges rejected me. And For me, reading that, I could easily see why for a lot of parents that was, they were freaking out because this student seemed great on paper, but didn't really have a specialized interest. Colleges are trying to build a class of students. So they need students who excel, in all different areas rather than 2,000 students who are all very similar. And simply put, there just aren't enough spots at the top colleges to admit all students, right? There are more valedictorians and students with perfect test scores, like you can see here, than there are spots. So while test scores and grades are important, that isn't where your children should be spending all of their time. So what are colleges looking for? If they're not looking for well-rounded students who are good at everything, what's important, what matters? Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. Great. So one of the traits that they're looking for is interestingness. Students who are interesting, or what I call uniquely impressive. Students who stand out from a group of 100,000 other students. This is something that where you have time on your side because you're starting to inquire about this with younger children. Developing interestingness and uniquely impressive activities outside of school takes time. It can take, 6 months or a year for students to even really start to understand what they're interested in outside of school. Most high schools offer and middle schools the same type of classes, whether it's AP like Marlboro or IB, there's only so much variety. The classes are really designed for the average student. So in order to cultivate like a deep interest outside of school, it's going to take a lot of exploration, reading, watching videos, taking more niche classes outside of school. We're going to get into how your students can do that. There's something in the college admissions world called the futures test. So college admissions officers are really admitting students based on a prediction of who they will become. Is your child going to become the next Amanda Gorman, a Nobel Prize winner, etc.? How do they predict that based on a 17-year-old? It's really by their qualities and traits that they're demonstrating in and outside of the classroom. And so it's important for them to showcase themselves as someone who's going to become highly successful in the future. And that really takes a specialized focus rather than being well-rounded. It might be excelling in poetry or math or sustainability, environmental science, really focusing most of their time and attention on excelling in one or two areas rather than trying to do it all. The trying to do it all approach is also what leads students to feeling really burnt out and overwhelmed. So while this approach might seem stressful for students so young, what I've found is that if you're following their natural interests, it's actually less stressful and will decrease the chances that your children will end up feeling really burnt out and overwhelmed as they get closer and closer to 11th and 12th grade. So how can you help your children cultivate these traits early on? So I'm going to take you through the framework that I've created. This is what all of our students go through, and then I'll give you some actionable tips as to how you can start to implement this with your children. So all of our students go through this 5-part process. This can span from 7th to 12th grade. It can span from 11th to 12th grade. Sort of however old your children are, you should start them on this process now. First is excavating, really taking a hard look at how your kids are spending their time. And I would recommend doing this with them, having a conversation of, do you like the things you're doing after school? What are you doing on the weekends that excite you? I have a student whose parents were concerned because she's obsessed with Nintendo, right? And they thought that was a waste of time. Actually, she wants to become the CEO of Nintendo. That's her dream. She's only 15 years old. So she's really obsessed with the history of Nintendo. Now she's going to be learning Japanese and doing college level research on the history and evolution of Nintendo. So you can channel their natural interests in a way that will excite them, but also help them prepare for applying to college. So that's what I would recommend is like the first step. No matter how old your kids are, even if they're younger, really make sure that they're enjoying how they're spending their time. And if they're not, I would start to carve out more time for them. Boredom is actually like a great way to generate interest. Once they have a little bit more time, the next phase is explore. This can take a few months or a few years, helping them explore new interests and ideas. And usually they need some guidance here because they're so young, they're not aware of everything that's available to them. So this might look like going to museums or lectures at a local university. If any of you live near universities, almost all of them have lectures that are open to the public, maybe like taking them to a lecture at Caltech about quantum physics, just trying different things. They may be resistant at first, but it usually just takes like one experience, one movie, one book for them to find something and become really fascinated by it. I do something called like getting lost in the library or bookstore, where you say, okay, you can buy 3 books, you have an hour, just go in the bookstore, walk around, pick things out that speak to you that you haven't heard of before. One of my students did that and developed an interest in classical civilizations and the birth of democracy. So really just coming up with different ways to expose your children to new, innovative, niche ideas is what will be most helpful for them at this point, and trying to just kind of like let them decide what they're interested in rather than guiding them towards something specific. Once they've done that and they have something specific they're interested in, then what we move into is developing expertise. So developing their skill set through projects, through research. This is pretty broad. It really depends on what your children's interests are. It could be through learning a language, through doing research with a college professor, through starting their own business, through creating something if they're interested in engineering, etc. Whatever it is, they want to spend at least a couple of years really honing in and developing their expertise. And then we move into evidence, right? They're going to be applying to college. They're submitting a PDF with 100,000 other PDFs. So they need to be able to showcase their interest and their expertise in a compelling way. That could be by creating a website. There's, a podcast, a magazine. There's many different ways to do this depending on what their interests are. And the longer your children have to do this, the less stressful it is. So if they're starting this in 7th grade or 8th grade, that's great because there's no rush. They're starting it later. There's a little bit more of that time crunch. There's the stress of 11th grade and standardized tests. So the earlier, the better. Although I've had students go through this whole process, in 6 months, it can be done. Lastly is essays and applications. Now, most parents think that the essays and applications part of the admissions process is the whole thing, but really that's just the end. It's important that they've gone through these 4 phases before in order to write strong essays, in order to have interesting experiences to talk about, to convey what they've done over the past few years. Okay, let's see. I think we have a question on this. Athletic ability. Yes, we're not going to focus too much on athletic ability today. However, if your child is an athlete, especially if they're a varsity athlete or a recruited athlete, a lot of this becomes less important if they're going to be recruited by college. However, I don't know if any of you have children at Marlboro or similar schools to Marlboro, but what I've seen with these kinds of students is that they also have a lot of academic interests and they might not want to become professional athletes. So it's harder to balance because athletics takes up so much time. But if your children, don't think they want to become professional athletes, then it's important that they also have another interest that they're cultivating over time that could align with what they might want to study in college and beyond. Okay, so we're going to break down like this initial part of this framework more specifically so that you can have some key takeaways from today. So the first step, once your children are exploring what they're interested in, is to come up with an area of specialization or what I call a theme. So Thousands of students take AP Bio, for example, and are interested in genetics. Most students have very vague college applications because there's not really a level of depth within school classes. So how is your child going to stand apart from all other students who take AP Bio and are interested in genetics, right? Maybe they're interested in how schizophrenia is passed down through generations in a rural village in South India and how this has led to mental health awareness. And they've done a research project around this with a professor at UCLA. They're going to stand out much more than another student who has similar but less specific interests. And now this should also be genuine, like they should genuinely be interested in doing this research and pursuing these activities. That's a really important component of this. How can they begin to do this? Through online classes, reading, honestly, just reading, listening to podcasts, TED Talks. These are great ways to learn more. Informal interviews with maybe family, friends, or just they can just email college professors, etc., find out more about these topics. Community college classes are a great way to just learn more. Wherever you live, your local community college should be open to high school students, even middle school students taking classes. All they need is, a signed consent form from a parent and a letter from their school counselor. That's a pretty straightforward process. They can also start auditing college classes. I find a lot of students don't take advantage of this, but all they need to do to audit a college class is to get permission from the professor. So this could be something to do at a local university. Summer programs. Summer programs, I think, are overutilized. They're pretty common. Doing a summer program at Brown isn't going to give your child a better chance of getting into Brown. So if they're interested in one of those, I would think about it more as a fun experience. And online, there are tons of online courses through edX and Coursera. These can be great ways for your children to just start figuring out more of what they're interested in. Here's an example of how you might help your children do this. So if you have a child who's interested in anthropology, now they might not know what anthropology is. So, that's going to start with a conversation, a book, a TED Talk. What are relevant fields similar to anthropology? So maybe archaeology and history. Now, how can we make that even more specific? Maybe they're interested in colonialism, cultural diversity, landscapes. And then how do you get even more specific with that? Colonial encounters between Indigenous people and Europeans in New England. Maybe that's something that fascinates them. Okay, so next we would think, how can we take this and make it even more specific to create some sort of research or project around it? Well, they could trace the lives and experiences of Native Americans in post-colonial contexts. They could do that through interviews, starting a podcast, working with a professor. Now, these are things that take time. It's much easier to do over time to cultivate this interest. Had a student who ended up going to a Navajo reservation to learn the language over summer. Because we'd started working on this theme, years in advance, they had plenty of time to do that. And he ended up writing really interesting essays. Who knows if this is going to connect to his career down the line? We'll see. It's a little too early to say, but these are the kinds of experiences that will be most helpful for your children in the college admissions process and also like in their own personal development. Sort of related, and next is background knowledge. It's important that your children have specialized background knowledge in addition to the standard classes they're taking in school. So if they're interested in pre-med, okay, what sorts of classes could they be taking outside of school that are a little bit more niche? If they're applying as creative writing majors, have they taken writing workshops? Have they submitted their own writing or maybe written a book? How do you gain background knowledge? Through college level coursework. Again, community college classes are great for this. Online classes, personal research, just reading and writing. Most people, I think, overlook how powerful just reading widely can be. I know a lot of kids don't like to read these days, but audiobooks, TED Talks, thinking of different ways to introduce them to new knowledge. and ultimately taking standardized tests. Standardized tests are, fortunately or unfortunately, becoming more important again. We're likely going to see most colleges start requiring tests again in the next few years. Next, a really important quality is intellectual independence. Colleges are really looking for students who are going above and beyond, who've taken an interest and pursued it beyond what's offered at high school outside of school. Supplementing what they're doing in school outside of school, starting at an early age, is really important because that's going to give them access to more ideas, more knowledge, more areas of specialization that just aren't available in high school. If any of you have children at Marlboro has a great honors research program that pairs students with college professors. If your children don't have a program like that at their high school, there are some other options, and I'll share my email at the end. You can send me an email and I can send you a list of those. So your children can do this through, again, college classes, meeting experts, writing, internships, volunteering, their own research. Okay, I know we only have a few minutes, so we're almost done, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. Next is research. Here's a quote from the Dean of Admissions at UPenn that nearly 1/3 of admitted students engaged in academic research during their time in high school, many earning national and international accolades for research that is already pushing the boundaries of academic discovery. Now, it's much easier for your children to do research towards the end of high school if they've already cultivated a niche or a theme and gained background knowledge over those few years of high school. And if your children's school doesn't have a program like Marlboro does, there are plenty of options for them to do that outside of school. And research isn't just for the sciences. You can do research, in the humanities, really in any field. Okay, let's see. We'll go through a quick case study and then I'll just open it up for Q&A. So yeah, I may just skip this one and go to the next one. Okay, so here's a case study of one of my former students, Ava, who's now a sophomore at the University of Chicago. She's a really great example of a student following their area of specialization without getting burnt out, right? She took APs, but only APs in subjects that she was really interested in. She was really careful not to get burnt out over high school as she attended a rigorous high school in Chicago like Marlboro, where a lot of students tend to, overload their schedule and get really overwhelmed. Ava was interested in the environment, but she was not interested in science. She's more interested in the humanities and urban planning. And so what she did over the pandemic is create an interdisciplinary online magazine that really focused on how to be sustainable coming from different lenses. And what she did is she started writing articles and then recruited other student writers from her high school. So a student who was interested in fashion wrote about how to be sustainable through fashion and slow fashion and thrifting, etc. A student who was interested in architecture wrote about sustainability from that lens. And so she really did a good job at delegating the workload, so she wasn't the only one doing everything. Then she contacted AP environmental science teachers at high schools throughout the US to start using her articles and materials in their curriculum, and a couple of them agreed. That was really great for her college essays. Then she started gaining traction with the website and got invited to be interviewed on different podcasts. Right, that was pretty low lift for her, as it really only takes an hour to be interviewed on a podcast. And then she ultimately started her own podcast. This was all she did outside of school. She put all of her focus into this one activity that organically blossomed and grew over time. So this is just one example, but something similar that your children could begin to work on over time. I know we don't. Okay, perfect. So we're at half an hour. My email is here. If you want to take a screenshot of this, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. About anything we discussed today about college admissions. I do teach a class for younger students on how to create this area of specialization. So feel free to send me an email and I can send over more information. I will, okay, stop sharing. I don't know if we have time for Q&A. Natalie, do we have
Yeah, We have a few
time.
minutes. Does
Okay.
anyone want to put a question in the Q&A box? We'll read them out.
I'm glad that was 30 minutes. I did not time the
That was
presentation. I
perfect.
was a little worried.
That's perfect. So the recording of this is going to be on the Marlborough YouTube channel. And so for anyone who may have missed it, who registered, they can watch it there. And everyone who is here watching it, they can watch it again.
Okay, great. Oh, okay, here we have one. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, more about test optional and how that may change. Yes, and if you send me an email, Dolly, I can email you a webinar that I recently did all about test prep, so that you can watch it. But the test optional movement has kind of backfired in that it made college admissions significantly more competitive. So some schools, the UCs, for example, UCLA, et cetera, made a decision to be test blind, which means they're not going to accept the SAT or ACT. However, word on the street is that they're creating their own test. We may see that in the next couple of years. At most other colleges, even though they're test optional, the majority of students who are admitted are submitting test scores. So it's going to become important again. I would strongly suggest, unless there's a good reason not to, that your children prepare to take the SAT or ACT, especially if they're applying to selective colleges. We're likely going to see most schools, MIT has already done this, but others start requiring the test again. Even if you have a junior who's applying this year, I would highly suggest they take the SAT or ACT. Okay, here we go. Oh, there's some more. What would you suggest for a student that doesn't have a focus yet? Yeah, Samantha. So discovering and cultivating that is going to be important. I teach a class on this. If you want to send me an email, navigating this as a parent, some of those tips I shared earlier on in the presentation, just exposing them to a lot of new ideas, going to museums, lectures, reading, watching TED Talks, exposing them to as much as possible so that they can find something to grab onto. We live in a rural area where my son is in 10th grade at a public school. Yeah, Kirsten, I would really recommend utilizing the internet, especially during the pandemic. A lot of my students were only able to do virtual opportunities. So I have a student right now in LA who's working for a professor at the University of Copenhagen, right? It's all their work is virtual. So I would recommend looking into opportunities that are online, of which there are so many. If you send me an email, I can send you some ideas. My son is 11. Yeah. Jana, 11, I would say, yeah, is definitely on the younger side. He has time that he can change his mind, so I wouldn't be putting too much pressure on it now. However, maybe he's interested in a language, say that he's really interested in also anime in Japan. If he starts learning Japanese now, there's not really a downside if he ends up becoming fluent in Japanese, but doesn't want to pursue it. There's no harm in that. So I would start thinking about things like that. Of course, his interests can change and shift, but I would say by 10th grade, you should have kind of a solid plan. Keeping in mind, once your children get to college, they can change their major. Most students do, so that's fine. But midway through high school, he should find something that he can stick to. A language, I think, is great for younger kids because there's no downside to learning multiple languages. Oh, okay, yeah, great. I'm glad it was helpful. And yeah, feel free to send me an email with any questions. I'm happy to send resources or anything that would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.